Let's be real. Artificial intelligence is, well, it's everywhere. It's shaping what you see online, what you buy, and more, how the world actually works. But with all the headlines, what's the real story with AI? In this explainer, we're going to cut through the hype. We'll look at its incredible promise, the messy reality of how it's being used right now, and some of the really tough problems we have to figure out. So let's get into it.
So, what's behind this AI explosion? Well, it really boils down to one thing: raw computational power. This chart says it all. The amount of computer power being used to train the biggest AI models isn't just growing, it's literally exploding. From what it took to train AlexNet back in 2012 to GPT-4, just over a decade later, the scale has gone up by an amount that's just, well, it's hard to wrap your head around. This right here is the engine that's driving absolutely everything.
And all that incredible power has led to some pretty amazing results. For the longest time, things like recognizing objects in a photo or understanding spoken language were things that only humans could do. But check this out. On a bunch of standard tests, AI systems are now actually surpassing the human baseline for those exact skills. Now, to be clear, we're talking about very specific tests, not some kind of general intelligence, but still, it just shows how capable these systems have gotten in certain areas.
But that's the real question, isn't it? I mean, it's one thing to ace a test, but it's something else entirely to change the world. So what does all this horsepower and all this benchmark-crushing performance actually mean for science, for business, and, for the rest of us?
All right, let's start with the promise. And honestly, there's no better example of AI's potential for good than a huge, massive breakthrough in pure science. This is where it all becomes crystal clear.
So, for about 50 years, biologists were banging their heads against a wall called the protein folding problem. Proteins are basically the tiny machines that make our bodies work, and their 3D shape is everything. It decides what job they do. The problem was, you could know all the ingredients, the amino acid sequence, but predicting how it would all fold up into its final shape was thought to be nearly impossible. And solving this was the key to everything from developing new medicines to understanding diseases.
And then AI just solved it. I mean, listen to this quote from Nobel laureate Venki Ramakrishnan. He called it a stunning advance, something that happened decades before many people in the field would have predicted. This wasn't just a small step forward, this was a complete game changer, a revolution.
The AI responsible was DeepMind's AlphaFold. And the timeline here just shows you the insane speed of this progress. In 2018, the first version wins a big competition. Great. Just 2 years later, AlphaFold 2 comes along and is so accurate it's comparable to doing slow, expensive experiments in a lab. And by 2024, the next version, AlphaFold 3, can predict how proteins interact with other critical stuff like DNA and RNA. It's just incredible.
But here's the most crucial part: the sheer scale of it. DeepMind didn't just solve the problem and lock it away. No, they used AlphaFold to predict the structure of over 200 million proteins. That's basically every protein known to science. And then they just put it all in a public database for free, for anyone. They essentially jump-started an entire field of biology overnight.
Okay, so we've seen the incredible, almost utopian vision of what AI can do for science. Now let's come back down to earth and talk about the much more complicated reality of how AI is actually being used in the real world of business and economics.
You might think every company out there is completely revamping their business with AI, right? Well, a big survey from McKinsey gives us a bit of a reality check. While almost everyone is dipping their toes in the water, just look at this breakdown. A full 2/3 of companies are still in the experimenting or pilot phase. Only about a third have really started to scale AI across their entire business. So, despite all the hype, we're still in the very early innings here.
So, why is that? Let's use hedge funds as a case study, since they've been at this for a while. The advantages are huge, right? They can use their private data to spot tiny predictive signals nobody else sees. But on the flip side, the challenges are enormous. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars a year just on computing power. There's an insane talent war where top researchers can make more than $1 million a year. And even after all that investment, you still need a human to make those big, contrarian calls.
This brings us to another really complicated area: trying to forecast the economy. It seems like the perfect job for a powerful AI, doesn't it? Just feed it all the data in the world and have it tell you where GDP is heading.
But here's a fascinating twist that comes from a working paper from the IMF. It turns out that sometimes the older, simpler economic models actually do a better job than the fancy new AI. How is that possible? Well, it's because things like historical GDP data don't actually go back that far. These incredibly complex AI models are prone to something called overfitting, which is just a fancy way of saying they start memorizing the random noise in the data instead of learning the actual underlying signal.
It's a perfect example of how sometimes simpler is actually better.
And this brings us to what is arguably the most important part of this entire conversation, the problems. We're talking about fairness, deep flaws, and outright falsehoods. Because as powerful as AI is, it can also be incredibly flawed, and those flaws can have very, very real consequences, especially when it comes to justice.
Let's dive right into a high-stakes, real-world example. It's an algorithm called Compass, and it's been used in the U.S. court system to help judges decide on sentences. Its job was to predict the likelihood that a defendant would commit another crime. The goal, of course, was to make the system more objective and data-driven. But in 2016, an investigation by ProPublica uncovered a really shocking disparity. Their analysis found that the algorithm was nearly twice as likely to falsely label black defendants as high risk, meaning it predicted they would reoffend when, in fact, they did not. On the surface, it looked like a clear, textbook case of machine bias.
But then, the company that created the algorithm, Northpoint, fired back. They said, hold on, you're measuring fairness the wrong way. Look at it like this. Of all the people we predicted would be high risk, how often were we right? And by that metric, the tool was actually slightly more accurate for black defendants. So who was right? Here's the devastating truth. They both were. It is mathematically impossible for an algorithm to satisfy both of those definitions of fairness at the same time when the underlying reoffense rates between the two groups are different. The problem isn't the math. It's that we as a society can't even agree on what fair really means.
And the problems go well beyond just bias. AI systems still really struggle with complex, logical reasoning. They can be completely untrustworthy, sometimes making up answers with total confidence. Their performance is totally dependent on the data they were trained on, which means they can fail spectacularly on new or rare problems. And oh, that Compass algorithm? A deeper look at the data shows it was also more severe with women than with men, a fact that gets overlooked in the debate all the time.
So where does that leave us? On one hand, we've got a technology that can solve scientific mysteries that have haunted us for 50 years. On the other, we have a tool that reflects and can even amplify our society's deepest flaws. And that is the central tension we have to navigate.
And as this quote from Our World in Data points out, right now, the immense responsibility for shaping this world-changing technology is in the hands of a very, very small group of people. And that's a precarious place to be. The decisions they're making in boardrooms today are going to affect all of us for decades to come.
Because ultimately, AI isn't some alien intelligence that just landed here. It's a mirror. It's trained on the vast ocean of data that humanity has created. All of our books, our articles, our art, our conversations. That data contains all of our knowledge and creativity, but it also contains all of our biases, our blind spots, and our historical injustices. So the final, most crucial question isn't really about what AI can do. It's about us. As we build this mirror, what should we ask it to reflect?